Wednesday night completed our study of the book of Jeremiah, and we're moving into the book of Lamentations, which is most likely written by Jeremiah. There are a couple of skeptics out there that aren't real convinced in their minds that Jeremiah was the author, but for the most part, most scholars conclude that Jeremiah is the author. It seems to fit his disposition and his sadness over the decline and the eventual fall of particularly Jerusalem and Judah. And so most contend that it is most likely written by the book of Jeremiah, or by Jeremiah. And so we're kind of going under that same conclusion in our study together in relationship to it. Basically, the book contains, and if you have your worksheets handy, we'll look together here at some of the things that are outlined in the introduction to this book by John. The introduction is by John Humphrey, not necessarily the whole material that we're looking at. But he mentions the fact that they're basically broken down into five laments. And always remember that when you're studying the Scriptures, it's interesting. We use the phrase book, chapter, and verse to emphasize the need for biblical authority, right? We use that phrase to make sure that we are diligently securing that what we're teaching, what we're practicing, what we're saying comes from the Bible. But in reality, book, okay, chapter, verse came way later. Jeremiah didn't sit down and write chapter 1, verse 1. Here we go. Chapter 2, verse whatever. They wrote a book. And then later, for study purposes and for organizational purposes, men came along later when translations were being established and determined. Men came along later and began to try to find the breaking points in conversations within books. Where were the transitional moments where the conversation maybe changes? And so they established chapter markings, and then you go back later and where can we break down verse by verse? And really, it's to simplify the ability for guys like me who get in a pulpit, and I don't have to say, okay, we're going to open your Bibles to the book of Jeremiah, and I'll give you 20 minutes to find the exact pinpoint spot where I'm at, because I don't have ability to say chapter 3, verse 20, or whatever it is. And so it makes it easier, but just remember, they didn't write it that way. They sat down and wrote the information that was necessary, and then it becomes part of a canon of books in Scripture. So here's this book of Lamentations, 5 different laments that are placed together in a book of Lamentations, most likely written by Jeremiah the prophet during, particularly when he sees what happened to Jerusalem. When he sees the fall. I'm convinced that most of what he's saying here in this book is related to the ultimate end and demise of Jerusalem. When he witnesses how desolate, how solitary, those are going to be the kinds of words we'll see when we study and read. When he sees the abject destruction of everything that he had held so dear to him over a period of time, he is wearied by it. He cries and weeps over it. He laments over those things. We won't take time to specifically look at it, but if at any point in your study you want to take a look at that outline breakdown, certainly that might help you kids kind of understand how the breaking points within each lamentation might occur. But we'll just kind of do that as we go in our study together throughout this book. Let me take you over into the passages themselves, because I want to know at least one other thing before we dive into chapter 1, and that is that there are 2 different titles, if you will, that are used in relationship to this book. In the Hebrew, it would have actually been rendered how. If you look at verse 1 of chapter 1, verse 1 of chapter 2, and verse 1 of chapter 4, you're going to notice the very same beginning to every single one of those Lamentations. The very beginning of each of those chapters in verse 1, you're going to see, I believe, depending on your translation, but you're going to see the word how. How did this happen? Sometimes it's worthwhile Generally, here's the problem. Generally, when we are trying to figure out the how something happened, it's usually because we're trying to pinpoint who's the what. Who's to blame for it, okay? But so I'm not saying that's always healthy. I don't know that it's always healthy to just try to be able to blame somebody for something and point a finger and say, there's the culprit. I don't know that that's always healthy, but I do believe it's healthy to figure out, how did this happen? How did this nation fall? How did this crumbling occur? How did these occurrences unfold? What was the reasoning behind them? Because if you don't figure out how something happened, you're likely to what? Repeat the same mistakes. Okay? Sometimes in my personal life, I need to ask myself, how did I get engaged in this sinful practice? How did I make this error? How did I fall in this particular problem? How did this occur? Because until I understand the how it happened, I may never be able to correct that process. And until I'm honest about it. So that imagery, I think, we'll share as we study these 5 chapters. We'll stop from time to time and talk a little bit about that. How did this happen? And if we can understand how it happened, then we might be able to understand how it is we can correct that and fix that before. But in particular, he just looks at what was once a very strong and vibrant place. And he says, how does this city sit solitary? How does this occur? And so in the Hebrew, a lot of times this book, it becomes labeled just with the Hebrew word meaning how. It was later in the Greek transcript, or the Greek manuscripts, that this book or collection of Lamentations were noted as Lamentations. In the original, in the Greek as well, then actually, I believe the word lamentation is actually a transliteration of a Latin word. And so there's a Latin word just slightly spelled differently, but it's basically Lamentations. And to get an English equivalent, we just transliterated it. Anybody know what I'm talking about when I say transliterated, by the way? Let me stop for a second. I say that, you might think, what in the world, is he crossing the ocean? What's he doing? But that's transatlantic, never mind. But transliterated simply means you had a word in one language. I'll give you another Bible illustration. The word baptism. Okay? The word baptism was baptismo in the Greek. And rather than just give it its actual definition, if you said that word to anyone who spoke Greek, they would immediately think of the word immersion. Okay? They understood the definition of that word. When they hear baptismo, they would immediately say to themselves, immersion in English. Okay? But for some reason, the scholars and translators of the Bible decided, rather than simply giving it its English equivalent, immersion, they transliterated it. So baptismo became baptism. Lamentation out of the Latin became lamentation into the English. And so rather than trying to find a word that accurately matches it in translation, sometimes they transliterate. They simply take the original word from the original language and just create a whole new word in English. As if we had it easy with English to begin with. Hardest language in the world to grasp. We don't recognize that because we all grew up with it. But talk to anybody else in the world and they'll tell you that English is one of the hardest languages to understand because we do everything backwards and forwards and sideways. And anyway, and for an example, if you were going to spell the word colonel, how would you do that? I don't think you'd have an L in the middle of it. I can tell you that much right now, right? But so language is hard, and sometimes rather than define things, they just transliterate it. So we end up with Lamentations and how our English Bibles typically refer to this collection here of these 5 chapters. And again, Jeremiah most likely writes this at the end of the destruction of Jerusalem. And remember, from our prior study, Jeremiah, he ends up, remember, he was given the ability to go into Babylonian captivity with certain comforts in some ways. Or he could stay home. He chose to what? Stay home. But then what happened? Yeah, the fellow said, we'll go wherever, we'll do whatever God tells us to do as long as he tells us to go to Egypt. He didn't tell them to go to Egypt, and they went anyway, and they dragged Jeremiah with them when they go down. But he has witnessed all these things. That's my point. He's been around to witness all the things that have been happening and transpiring through all the captivities and through all the challenges and the ultimate destruction. And so somebody who's sitting in captivity in Babylon may read or hear about the devastation happening back in the homeland. But it's going to affect them differently than a guy who's sitting there watching it all happen. And so Jeremiah sits there and watches all this happen, and he pens these 5 laments over what he's seen. How could this ever occur? And he begins to write. Lots of questions about the introduction. Okay, jump in. Lamentations chapter 1, verse 1. How doth the city sit solitary, that was full of people? She is become as a widow, that was great among the nations. She that was a princess among the provinces is become tributary. There are 2 basic thoughts here when he looks around. He once saw a Jerusalem hustle and bustle of people, crowded marketplaces. You can only imagine. You think about some place that you have been maybe that is very busy and just seems to be always active and full of people, and then you go visit that same place and it's almost eerie to see it empty. Even simple things. I remember one time we were doing a movie thing up at the community college 25, 26 years ago, whenever it was. Back when 3D was black and white, you had to wear the red and white or red and blue glasses, and it didn't work. And anyway, so we were there late one night, and a buddy of mine and I stepped outside on the streets of New Martinsville. There are usually cars parking, people going, and coming and going. Nobody out there. And the bell tower went off, and we about come out of our skin, because it was so quiet. You're used to the cars, you're used to people, and you see the same environment. And there's almost an eerie feel to it because it's now what you're used to seeing it as is completely different. Jeremiah sees this once busy, active city. People coming and going. It was the city on the hill, right? It was the place that everyone eventually matriculated to. It was, it was always had something. He uses that description. He said, once we had princes, or she that was a princess among the provinces has become tributary. They were once the place where people what? Brought their tributes. Now they are the ones contributing to other nations. There's a complete reversal of the feel of the nation and the people there in Jerusalem. A once busy place, now empty. A place that once had others coming to honor it is now having to go and honor others. She weepeth sore in the night, and her tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers she hath none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They are become her enemies. From a national standpoint, you can almost imagine the utter devastation they're feeling. As once people came to bring tribute to them, and they have become the exact opposite of that, and now also they have become the laughing stock, if you will, of nations. People mock and scoff at them that once stood with them. Nobody's coming to their aid. Nobody's coming to help them. And I couldn't help but think, and you got to kind of think about the things that Jeremiah taught them and prophesied to them to understand the lamentation as well. But sometimes that's the result of bad behavior. Sometimes the result of sinful bad behavior is slowly but surely you begin to alienate yourself from everyone that was once helpful and close and beneficial and strengthening. And they just continued on their sinful path. They continued on their challenging path. And because of that, they became more and more and more isolated. And now there's nothing left to do but sit back and cry. and weep over the remembrance of what they once were and what they have become. Judah's gone, verse 3, into captivity because of affliction and because of great servitude. She dwelleth among the nations, she findeth no rest. All her persecutors overtook her within the streets. Remember, their kings had been telling them all along that they'll survive this. We'll make it. We'll get through this. We're going to win. We've never lost. And now all of a sudden, the devastation has come. Jerusalem has fallen. The destruction is round about them. The tears are flowing. And they can't hardly believe what has happened. And so this once proud city, how did Jeremiah describe it there in verse 1?
A widow?
Yeah, that was an interesting description there. He said they're a widow. They're the aloneness of this once proud and boisterous city, in particular Jerusalem here, is now empty and facing challenge. And what does Jeremiah say about the friends and enemies of Jerusalem?
Their friends will become their enemies.
Yeah, it's the exact reversal. The friends are now the enemies, and there's no one. The imagery is there's no one coming to aid. And here's the saddest part about this as well. Not only did anyone come to their aid and help them when Babylon comes and brings this destruction, but the imagery is that nobody even cares. I mean, you think about the emptiness of that feeling, that they have hit rock bottom. They are weeping over the sad realities of what's happened there in Jerusalem and in Judah, and no one comes to weep with them. No one comes to mourn with them. No nation is concerned about it. It's really sad to see the realities of what they have created for themselves in these challenges. Thoughts or questions up there? All right, verse 4. The ways of Zion do mourn, because none come to the solemn assembly. All her gates are desolate. Her priests do sigh. Her virgins are afflicted, and she herself is in bitterness. What obviously has stopped happening there in Jerusalem that should always be happening in Jerusalem? Worship. Okay? That seems to be the picture, especially with this reference of Jerusalem as Zion. They do mourn the ways of Zion. Jerusalem, though over a period of time, and then eventually in the days of Jesus, it had become a very commercial kind of place. But Jerusalem's intent and purpose from the beginning was to become the hub for what? Worship and prayer to God. Okay, it was the center for all of the Israelites to come and to worship and honor their God. It was the central place for them to bring their respect and their worship. But he said, the ways, the things that should be happening, they're no more. Because none come to the solemn assembly. All her gates are desolate. Her priests do sigh. Her virgins are afflicted. And she herself is in bitterness. Even the handful of priests that may have survived this process and ended up being able to stay in the region, it's like you get the imagery of opening up the doors, but if you've still got a door and the gates are gone, and you stand there and you sigh at the fact no one's coming. You could call an assembly every day, all day long. No one's coming. They have been met with the destruction that God intended for them, and it has brought them to the bottom. And we really won't see worship there again until
No, till Nehemiah.
right. And then Zerubbabel and them start the process of coming back. Nehemiah comes back, and they begin to reestablish first the temple. And even at that, it took them how long? Trying to restrict your Bible history here for a minute. It's 20 years, I think, was it not, after they come back, because they got people started complaining about it, and it caused some trouble, and people said, we don't want to die trying to build this building. And so they hesitated, and then had another king comes along, makes a decree, allows them to get back to building the temple again. So it's going to be quite a while before worship is restored back into Jerusalem, and the temple is restored. And so the challenges that they face, and I'm just going off the top of my head with some of that history. So her adversaries are become the head, her enemies prosper, for Jehovah hath afflicted her for the multitude of her transgressions. Her young children are gone into captivity before the adversary. They were the once the prosperous nation. They were once the one that people feared. They were the ones that once folks knew that they should be cautious in how they dealt with. Now, others lead them. Others are responsible for them. For Jehovah hath afflicted her for the multitude of her transgression. And keep this fresh in your minds throughout Jeremiah and throughout this book too. All of these things are happening to them because of what? Because of their own sins, okay? These things did, sometimes it's a hard kind of balancing act in some ways, because we want to respect and recognize the power of God and His ability to choose Babylon, bring them down there, destroy His own people if He chooses to do so. But don't forget the other side of this, which is that their actions is what brought this on. And so there's God working, but God doesn't have to work sometimes, if you will, outside of what is occurring naturally anyway. In other words, their sins and their transgressions had been weakening them anyway. They were vulnerable and ripe for the destruction that was coming because of their own conduct and actions. And yes, God's involved. Yes, God plans. Yes, God purposes. All that is true. But they're the ones ultimately responsible for why this happens. Their transgressions and their actions is what brought all of this on to begin with. From the daughter of Zion, all her majesty is departed. Her princes are become like harts that find no pasture, and they are gone without strength before the pursuer. They're running away. The once mighty men, the men that would once fight for the nation to the death, are now just running like a deer trying to find a place to graze for a moment. And their pursuers are faster, stronger, greater than those once mighty men. Jerusalem remembereth, verse 7, in the days of her affliction and of her miseries, all her pleasant things that were from the days of old, when her people fell into the hand of the adversary, and none did help her. The adversary saw her, they did mock at her desolation. Generally what happens when things go bad, what does your mind do? You start to think about what? Yeah, you try to think about, you think back, and you start this comparison. And you begin to think about when things were better, things were greater, and that's kind of what they're doing. Jerusalem remembereth in the days of her affliction and of her miseries all her pleasant things that were from the days of old. And so here they are, all the greatness and all the pleasantries and all the wonderful things that happened for them and the things that they had to their benefit when they honored God, when they trusted God, when they were blessed by Him. Now are just an ancient memory. They're just a thought that they have in the back of their minds because of the environment they've created for themselves through their sinful behaviors. It's amazing, really, how drastically changed the nation has become. Jerusalem hath grievously sinned, verse 8. Therefore she is become as an unclean thing. All that honored her despise her, because they have seen her nakedness. Yea, she sigheth and turneth backward. The imagery is that the nation has been exposed. They had been portrayed as a righteous nation. They had been portrayed as a nation that Jehovah God honored and blessed. They were known as a nation of people who were respected and built up. But But now their sinful behaviors have been exposed. Their transgressions, their actions have been exposed. And people look and they say, "Man, they're not as great as we once thought they were. They're not as powerful, not as mighty, not as righteous, and not as strong as everyone once thought." Her filthy skirts, in verse 9, are evident. She remembered not her latter end. Therefore is she come down wonderfully. She hath no comforter. Behold, O Jehovah, my affliction, for the enemy hath magnified himself. Remember, all this started with what word in verse 1? How? How did we get here? That's what Jeremiah said. How? How did this once great nation, how did we find ourselves in such sinful treachery? How did we find ourselves in such a mess? And now being subject to the ultimate consequence and destruction that God has brought to us. We were once wonderful and mighty and powerful. And now there's no one to comfort, no one concerned. No one even is worried about the condition of the people. For the enemy hath magnified himself. A fall was hard, but it was necessary. For them, it was going to be necessary. The beauty in all this is, the other side of this, again, you have to use your remembrance of the things we've studied out of Jeremiah, but all these other nations are eventually going to what? They're going to fall in a much greater way. Okay? That's part of the prophecy as well. And so this is temporary for God's people. It's going to become permanent for some of the others. And so Jeremiah sees the devastation and the sadness and the challenge. But at least he has the hope of knowing that God's made a promise to restore them and return them back as a nation. But right now, all he can do is think back to the way things once were and what a devastating fall that they've encountered and the challenges that it's brought. And that can happen to any nation. It can happen to anybody. No matter how great and powerful they once were, it can happen to anybody. And what a sad thing it would be for folks to have to sit around in our own nation someday and just lament. And all you've got is the lamentation of the way things once were and the greatness of it. Go ahead, Roger. I'm sorry.
Well, I'd like to get this in before you're done.
You're fine. You got 10 minutes.
Whenever you study this, we're told. I keep remembering we are told that these things are written for our learning, and so I keep applying most of what I'm hearing to us today.
Yeah.
And Hebrews chapter 3, the last two verses, and the first two verses of chapter 4. But with whom was he grieved 40 years? Was it not them that had sinned, whose carcasses fell in the wilderness? And to whom sware he that they should not enter into his rest? To them that believe not. So we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief. Now, the next two verses in 4, let us therefore fear, lest the promise be left us of entering into his rest, and if you should seem to come short of it. For to us was the gospel preached as well as unto them, but the word preached did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in them that heard it. And they didn't have the faith. They kept losing it.
And did I hear another voice a minute ago before I add to what Roger said? The two things about that, Roger, that I think about in making the parallel. One is that there's no longer any physical nation that God has a preference for. And so the one thing Judah had gone for it, or the Israelites, Judah and Israel really, when they were still. So one thing they were the nation of God. They were the people of God. And at the end of the day, he was going to allow for them in that time period to come back. But no one today has that same guarantee. Nobody has that same relationship from a physical nation standpoint. So if God was willing to address all these nations in the manner and He did, and the only one that He seems to hold out any remnant of hope for is His own people that were His physical nation at the time, then what we learn from that is We don't even have that going for us. And so we could just be destroyed and gone as a nation.
Right.
From a physical standpoint. We could be Ammon, or we could be one of Babylon, or whatever.
But it applies to our spiritual
Yeah,
now.
and that's the other connection. So you can talk about it from the physical side of things, but maybe more importantly is that was the people of God. The body of Christ are now the people of God. And though that remnant will always be until Christ returns, that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be here. And you know, I couldn't help but think in my own mind when I was studying this, you know, how would I feel if I walked in this building and it was empty and no one, you know, no one to open the gate, or the gate be destroyed, or you call for an assembly and no one comes, and you know how sad that would be to think about those kinds of things. And here's the reality. We could start making a list of places that we are not Campbellites, okay, on the record, but you think about that. In our area, where was one of the restoration movements came out of Bethany, and nobody worships in that building that was once so full that people stood outside its windows to hear Campbell speak. And nobody worships there on a regular basis. It's rented out here and there for different things. Some purposes it's used for. But my point is simply this: it didn't happen anywhere. I think about remember when we did the 7 churches of Asia. To my knowledge, they don't exist anymore. They're gone. You think of in fact, you go back. I'm going to do this someday. I don't have time to do it with you right now, obviously. But I want to go back, and when I figure it out as much as I can, I'll share it with you. But I'd like to go back into the Bible and look at every place that was mentioned that had a church that was established, and start to look and see if it's still there, if there's any remnant of it still there. And my point is, we have to do everything we can to be diligent to allow for this body, this local assembly, to continue to be strengthened and to survive over the years ahead. And it doesn't have to have 250 from the 1980s to be strong, but it does have to have somebody to be strong. It has to have people willing to maintain and keep the congregation serving the Lord in the community.
In my lifetime, Brian, I can remember when there were at least a dozen congregations around right this area that were open there no longer. And that's just weird.
Within one lifespan.
Within one lifespan.
Yeah. I talked to an older lady over in Ohio one time, and she rattled off in different varied ways, but 32 different places she referenced that were either gone or had left their first love in relationship to the scriptures. And so it's amazing how that can happen over a period of time. And that's the dedication and that's a responsibility on both sides of the age spectrum. That takes an older generation willing to educate, encourage, and build up and strengthen the coming generation. And that takes the heart of a younger generation that wants to honor God and wants to maintain service to Him. And so it takes every age group along that path to sustain it. But you can only imagine the lamentation. I think about, there's a handful of places, I can't remember off the top of my head the name of it. It's not far from here, but it's a place, and I think it's a property issue or some things, but they meet once a year. The requirement on the deed was that they had to meet once a year in order to keep the property. And so a bunch of people go out and meet there once a year and have a service. But otherwise, the building sits empty. And to me, I can't imagine how heartbreaking that would be to go out once a year and lament over what maybe was once a vibrant, faithful place, honoring their God. But that's what's happened to the people of God here in Jeremiah's Lamentation. Our people sigh, verse 11. They seek bread. They have given their pleasant things for food to refresh the soul. See, O Jehovah, behold, for I am become abject. They're even willing to give up important relics, if you will, utensils, items that were once important to them. Their only concern is they're what? I'm hungry, right? They'll give up all the things that were once important and valuable to them. Right now, the only thing that matters is getting the next slice of bread. And that's how devastating the circumstances become. Is it nothing to you, all ye that pass by? Behold and see if there be any sorrow like unto my sorrow, which is brought upon me, wherewith Jehovah hath afflicted me in the day of his fierce anger. You can't help but think, Jeremiah watches these other nations just kind of walk on by and see the devastation, and see the hunger, and see the poverty, and see all the things that are going on, and it doesn't faze them. They don't do anything. And that's part of this judgment in some ways of the fierce anger of God that has come. From on high hath he sent fire into my bones, and it prevaileth against them. He hath spread a net for my feet. He hath turned me back. He hath made me desolate and faint all the day. I suppose if I had felt that way all the day, I would probably be writing a lament of my own. I don't know whether you keep a diary or you ever take notes about events and things around in your life, but can you only imagine? Here's Jeremiah recording how he's feeling about the things that he's seen round about. The yoke of my transgressions is bound by his hand. They are knit together. They are come up upon my neck. He hath made my strength to fail. The Lord hath delivered me into their hands, against whom I am not able to stand. It is really a sad, sad book. And we'll study it over the month of September, Lord willing. But I won't stay long because it will be miserable, and rightly so, when you read the descriptions throughout the book. So Lord willing, Wednesday night we'll come back and begin here towards the end of chapter 1, and we will move forward into chapter 2.